Okay, welcome everybody to our webinar, A Future for the Amazon, A Future for All. This webinar is part of the launch of Development and Peace's new campaign for our common home. In April of 2018, Pope Francis went to Peru and did a visit. And while he was there, he announced that there would be a synod on the Amazon. At the time, it felt really like a historical moment for the people there. And when he made that announcement, Pope Francis said, the native Amazonian peoples have probably never been so threatened on their land as they are now. And it sort of gave some of the context as to why Pope Francis was having this synod on the Amazon. And today with this webinar, we're going to dig deeper into what the synod means for the church here in Canada, for the people of the Amazon, and for us as engaged people on how we can respond to the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor that the Pope is sending to us as a call to action. We have three very special guests with us today. But before we start, I just wanted to give a little introduction to Development and Peace for those who may not be familiar with the organization. So Development and Peace was founded in 1967 by the Bishops of Canada to strengthen solidarity with people in the global South. At the time, it was Vatican II, and Bishops of Canada had met with particularly bishops of Brazil, which I think is very pertinent for this upcoming campaign in the Synod. And they asked the bishops of Canada to really create solidarity between the North and the South and reflect on how our way of living has an impact on poor communities. So Development and Peace has been doing that work for over 50 years now in two ways. One is by supporting local organizations in over 30 countries in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, and Latin America, including many countries where the Amazon is present, and as well by doing education campaigns here in Canada and advocacy and trying to help people here understand the injustices that are happening to poor communities, to the most vulnerable in those countries and in the global South, and how they can act to make change. So today with our webinar, as I mentioned, we're going to be looking at the Synod. Our special guests today are Bishop Don Bolen, who's the Archbishop of the Diocese of Regina. We have Josianne Gauthier, who worked at Development and Peace for many years, who worked as a program officer for humanitarian aid, as part of our general management, and then as director of our In Canada programs, and is now Secretary General of CIDSE, an alliance of 18 Catholic international social justice organizations. And CIDSE really works on advocacy and looking at addressing the structural causes of poverty in the world. And we have Mauricio Lopez, who's the Executive Secretary of REPAM, an ecclesiastical network in Latin America that has helped a lot in the preparations for the Synod. So we'll start today with Bishop Bolen, who can speak to us a bit about the Synod and its significance for the church here in Canada. Oh, I think Bishop Bolen, you might be on mute.
Sorry about that.
That's okay.
Very good.
Great.
Very good. I thought we were starting with Mauricio, but I'm happy to begin. Very grateful to be a part of this webinar, and grateful to have Mauricio and Josianne with us. Mauricio, we know how much you and REPAM have done in preparation for the upcoming Synod, and we're deeply grateful for that. There was a meeting in Washington, D.C. in March, where I had the privilege of attending, and I would say it was the best meeting that I've ever attended in my life. And it was organized by REPAM in conjunction with the Jesuit community held at Georgetown University. And that meeting, which brought together participants in the synod, certainly Cardinal Barreto and Cardinal Hummes, who are going to play a pivotal role in it, other staff from REPAM, and Indigenous people from the Amazon region. It also brought people from different parts of the world. And for me, that meeting was a primer on how we as Canadians can participate in and be connected to the upcoming synod. So I think moving towards the synod, the questions that we ask are critical and will shape what we can do, how we can respond. So in a few minutes, I think my most important contribution will be to help us to ask the right questions as we follow the synod and reflect on it afterwards. So I've got 4 questions, and the first 3 are really double questions. So the first question is, what is happening in the Amazon? And in the first instance, what is happening to the environment there? And secondly, what is happening to Indigenous peoples there? At the Washington meeting, we got to hear wonderful presentations, but frightening presentations about environmental degradation and in the Amazon region, and how the Amazon, which is the largest rainforest in the world, has a huge impact, not only on the Amazon region, but on has a huge impact globally. And I suspect from Maurizio, we're going to hear a little more about that environmental crisis in the Amazonian region. Of course, since then, we've had a terrible experience of the fires in the Amazon region. So the synod, unfortunate because of the fires, but could not be timed better because this is a world crisis. Secondly, what is happening in the Amazon to Indigenous peoples? How are they being marginalized? How are they being manipulated? And how are they being oppressed? And that's another story where others will be able to tell us, but we need to be asking that question. What is happening in the Amazon that is vital for us? So I'm very grateful for the Development and Peace Fall Action Campaign and the materials that have been prepared. And I invite all the viewers of the webinar to check out the Fall Action materials, and as a very good introduction to the synod and how we can be connected to it. The second question is, are there parallel challenges for us in Canada? I got introduced to a new word in Washington, the word biome. A biome is a large ecological area on the Earth's surface with fauna, flora adapting to their environment. So a biome is shaped by temperature, climate, geology, soils, vegetation. And in Canada, we also have one of the world's largest biomes, which is our boreal forest. So the boreal region in Canada covers almost 60% of the land area. And by its sheer vastness and forest cover, it makes an important contribution to our health. I mean, it shapes our environment profoundly, but it also makes an important contribution to our Indigenous people, to their economy and way of life. So I think we're invited in this conversation to pay attention to and learn about our boreal forest. Secondly, which has its own crisis, right? Its own tendencies or trajectories, which are deeply problematic. Secondly, we're invited to ask and learn more about our Indigenous peoples. We've just lived through the Truth and Reconciliation process. So we know much more than we did 15 years ago about the legacy of residential schools, and we're learning about the impact of colonization. If we look at societal indicators of health, societal indicators of well-being, our Indigenous people are being systematically marginalized. I would say that there is those societal indicators in terms of access to health, access to clean water, access to education, graduation levels, incarceration, addiction, family breakups. Our Indigenous people are being marginalized, and I would say that there is a systemic racism in our society, in our societal structures, and we need to pay attention to that. We need to learn a new way to walk with Indigenous people. We need to learn from Indigenous people. We need to come to terms with our past, to tell the story of our nation, our history differently. So that will be one of the key challenges. It was interesting to go to a meeting about the Amazon and to be given the challenge to look in our own backyard at parallel situations where we have work to do. The third question that I think we need to ask is about the relationship between Canada and the Pan-Amazon region. And the first part of that, I've already hinted at it, is how are we being affected by the current crisis in the Amazon? How is our environment here being impacted by environmental degradation there? And I think it's good to ask the moral question also, how are we affected here by the oppression of Indigenous peoples or the marginalization of Indigenous peoples there? That's an important question for us to ask. The second part of that is, how are we implicated in the crisis? And the most direct way is an issue that Development and Peace has been working on for a long time, and not alone, is that many of the mining companies operative in the extractive industry in the Amazon region are Canadian-based companies. And we've been pushing for an ombudsperson. Looks like we've got an ombudsperson, but is an ombudsperson being given enough role and responsibility, and is that role being treated as something which can really address systemic injustices? I think that's something for us to monitor and something for us to work on. So the fourth question is, what can we do? What can we do as a church? What can we do societally? What can we do in our communities, in families, and in our personal lives? I think this synod invites us to action, but it's going to take some discernment in terms of how we act effectively. Kelly, in her very introductory comment, raised a key theme from Laudato Si. We need to pay attention to the cry of the earth, and we need to pay attention to the cry of the poor. In this instance, we have a particular focus in the latter on Indigenous peoples, the Indigenous peoples of the Amazon, and we need to pay attention to fostering and building, restoring Indigenous relations in this country. I think that's exceedingly important for us. So I think those questions can guide and shape our following of the synod and our participation in the work that will flow from the synod. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bishop Bolen. I think that gave us a very good understanding of why this synod is important for those of us here in Canada. And I'm going to pass the floor now to Maurizio, who I think might answer a few of the questions that you raised, and will probably make us have a few other questions as well. So go ahead, Maurizio.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today, and I certainly appreciate the possibility to go after Monsignor Bolen and before Josianne. We've been working together for a few years now, and I think Development and Peace has done an amazing work trying to bring the voices of the people in the territory into the mainstream discussions in the northern part of the world. That is very, very important. And it's, I'd say, one of the more relevant issues at stake today. Otherwise, the Synod will just remain as another event, a church event, and will not produce the changes that is called to produce. So I thank you for that. As you mentioned, Kelly, the visit of Pope Francis to Puerto Maldonado, Peru, was a very, very important milestone. And I think more than words, and he said very strong words there, but it was about signs. He leads by example. And if you see the photos of the place, I had a privilege to be there, he came in and he sat down to listen. He didn't come there as the one having all the responses to the questions, to all of the answers, but rather to sit down. And he listened to the cries of the peoples. And he really, truly listened from his heart. And then he heard the hopes they had and the invitations they had. And then he participated in their celebration of life, not questioning it, not pointing out at it, saying that this is something that threats our church and our religion, but actually embracing the diversity, the riches of the culture. And this was very beautiful. So he didn't speak for the first 40 minutes, only until he heard what was happening, and then he offered his own perspective. So I think this is what we are called to do in this synod, to actually listen to the people of God living day in and day out these situations that cannot longer continue. So I think this is a very important point that I wanted to make. And I want to bring a phrase, a quote from Teilhard de Chardin, which I love. And I think it's very helpful at this moment in time, because it's really about the core of our identity, our spiritual being. And this is, I think, very significant. And he said, we are not human beings having a spiritual experience, but we are spiritual beings having a human experience. This changes everything. This shift from our own doing, our control on things, and having things our way, changes into being part of a process in which we can connect with life, with future, way beyond ourselves. And I think the Synod can bring a lot of the good examples on this. And it's not about protecting ourselves into our own beings and our own identities, but rather trying to flow as the rivers do in terms of connecting with life. What's at stake is the future. Our home is on fire, and it's literally on fire. This is not a mention, as Monsignor Bolen was saying, this is not something that we use as a metaphor. Our home is actually on fire. And it's not only the Amazon in Brazil and Bolivia, but also the region of the Congo Basin in Africa, and also Indonesia and the Asia Pacific forest. And this is caused by the desire of having more and more and expanding the agribusiness frontier in terms of getting more revenue out of the earth. But at the same time, we have found the limits of our own societies today. We cannot avoid the calls that we get and the flags that we're getting from the United Nations, all of the scientific panels saying we cannot continue like this. So I think this is also very relevant today, because the Amazon has a possibility to respond to that. But I think one thing that needs to be clear for Canada and the northern part of the planet is that we are connected. The future and the possibility to change it can only happen if we work together. For example, it's important to know that 1 out of 5 glasses of water that you drink there where you are comes from the Amazon. 20% of the water that humans can consume, not frozen, comes from the Amazon. Same thing with the oxygen. Some people contest that data, but at least 1 out of 5 breaths every living being has is also coming thanks to the Amazon. So it's one of the big lungs of the planet. So we need to know how connected we are with it. But at the same time, the voices of the indigenous peoples there bring new perspectives. We should not be threatening for us. Actually, they offer different ways of responding. And I think we can see today that we have failed as societies to respond to that. So, for example, today, the problem with the ecological crisis is caused by our own decisions. It's not possible that today in the world, we have 26 families concentrating the same amount of riches that as the 50% poorest portion of this planet. That's 3,600 million people, equaling 26 families, 1% of the population of the planet, today concentrating 99% of the assets. This is not an issue of not having enough resources or natural resources. It's about the distribution of riches, and this dynamic that Pope Francis calls on, and he is very confrontative about this, the throwaway culture. So the Synod, we need to understand that it's about a concrete territory. There is no doubt about it, but it's also a call for the universal church in the world as a whole to find new ways to respond on things. The guardians of the forests, and at the same time, the guardians of the future, are those indigenous communities. So it's not about a folkloric perspective or just reading an interesting news about the indigenous peoples. There is that we are completely and absolutely connected to them. A second element that I want to offer is that we are in a tension of how we understand time. So there is the possibility of revelation of God, what we call a kairos moment. This is a graceful moment in time because we see how God is taking part in our story and trying to offer new possibilities, but we cannot control it. It just takes time. We need to understand that this is the flow of life, as I was saying, and indigenous communities can really relate to that. But at the same time, we have an urgency, the chronos dynamic. We need to respond to the crisis today. The United Nations have told us that from now until 2030, we have to drastically change the way we do things. Otherwise, the change in climate will have a direct impact, especially on those who are the poorest in this planet. And the third tension that I want to bring to you is the tension on the reform underway. Pope Francis is trying to bring some reforms to the church, and this is good. It's good to change. It's good to find the new ways of the Spirit to present himself and reveal himself, herself to us. But there are a lot of contrasting positions opposing any type of change. And this is a moment in which we see how life is threatened, and we know that we have to change. So at the same time, there is a tension with the call from Pope Francis to bring a new synodal way to lead the church, bringing the voices of the people to participate, to offer their own insights. And this is what happened with the preparation for the Synod. REPAM had the opportunity to go all over the place in the Amazon region, which includes 9 countries. And we had the privilege to listen to 87,000 people, which we recognize as the voice also of the people of God, bringing their perspectives into the table. And the way the document for the Synod has been developed is connected to that. So it's important to know that regardless of the oppositions of very few voices, but very loud, we need to focus on what's important. 87,000 people, many of them coming from the indigenous communities, participated directly in the process of the preparation for the Synod. This is completely new for the church, and it's the first time. A second element is that it's connecting the new ways for the church, the need to change as a church, and this will have certain implications in the universal church. At the same time that we find possibilities for an integral ecology. So that's the second element. I think it's important there in the Synod. So I'd like to finish just with one element which I think is very important. So what's at stake today is this confrontation of the throwaway culture versus or in front of the culture of encounter. Indigenous communities and people on the ground teach us new ways to walk with one another, to have a better harmony with our own environment. So we have to pay attention. And I think it's important to know that we are completely and very, very much connected if we want to make those changes happen. So I think we have movements around the world, and I know we have people from different places today that who are trying to respond to that, as Monsignor Bolen was talking about. There is a big network, as one we have in the Amazon region, already moving forward in the Congo Basin. There is another one also in the Asia Pacific region. In Europe, thanks to CIDSE, and I'm sure Josianne will talk about that, we have the bishops and also institutions like CIDSE trying to work out on how to better accompany, not only assisting the reality of the South, but actually taking ownership and responsibility for the things that need to change there in the North. And as it was mentioned also for the United States, I think the urgency of the moment is also providing with the possibilities to be more connected. So please do not pay attention to those voices trying to harm the process, trying to oppose anything and everything, and try to focus on what's coming from the lives of the people, which we are meant to protect, to defend, and to accompany, and recognizing how Pope Francis is calling us to respond as he did in Puerto Maldonado, listening to what's happening, embracing the identity of the people, celebrating life, and then calling all of the church to respond to this. The Synod will be a major event. I think we are getting some reactions. It's exactly because it was urgent to have such an assembly, and there is a lot of hope. I cannot tell you how much hope, joy, and unity we experience in the ground, and also with all of our brothers and sisters around the world, and in this kind of invitations where we feel and we know that we can change, that we need to change, and that God is with us all throughout as we bring peace, hope, and unity in this process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mauricio. I think you gave us a very good perspective of what Pope Francis's approach is, this synodal way, as you called it, and also the scope of this synod, of the amount of people that were consulted, and what how this synod is really a historic moment. Just before we continue, I just wanted to mention that we are about 100 people across Canada who are here, so it's really great to have everyone. We'll be opening the question period soon, so if people want to start sending in their questions, they can write them in the Q&A box at the bottom. Now we'll continue with Josianne. CIDSE works with organizations like Development and Peace, and she'll tell us a bit more, maybe Josianne, on how advocacy comes into play in terms of the outcomes of the Synod and how CIDSE has been involved in the Synod preparations as well.
Okay, thank you, Kelly. You're a brave woman to put Mauricio, Bishop Don, and myself on the same panel in just 1 hour, because you know how passionate we get, and we could speak for hours about this, but I will try to restrain myself, as I can see my colleagues did. So CIDSE, as you mentioned, is basically the alliance of social justice organizations, Catholic social justice organizations, founded all around the same time as Development and Peace in different parts of the world by Vatican II call to bring solidarity into the world, right? To change from a colonial missionary model to a solidarity model. And that's the mission that we've been on for over 50 years, most of our organizations, but it's still a struggle and a challenge on a daily basis to confront that model that we've inherited, right? And the reality of it. And something about what Mauricio said reminded me of another Jesuit friend of ours, Pedro Walpole, who described the Pope, Pope Francis, as being the man who speaks truth to power. And it's very disturbing for people in power to hear the truth. It's a very uncomfortable truth. It's a truth about imbalance, about injustice, about the injustice that Mauricio mentioned. So for people in power, such as ourselves, people who have, by no particular merit, inherited a very wealthy country to live in with very comfortable conditions, with less danger, with an access to what seems like limitless resources, and we somehow magically have consumer goods from all around the world, and we don't pay attention to where they're coming from or how much we're consuming, and the conditions that it's creating, the degradation, the human conditions, the dignity that it's affecting around the world. So that interconnectedness is also our power, which we have to recognize, and it's not always a pretty thing, and take some responsibility for that and try to begin that change, that transformation. So that ecological conversion, about recognizing that we're all one common family and one common home, is also taking personal, individual responsibility and moving that into political action. So that's what CIDSE tries to do in a nutshell, is to wrap that idea of Laudato Si into political action. There is a call to political action, so we take that up as our work plan. And how do we do that? Well, we're taking messages from Laudato Si all the time into the European institutions and into the UN, for instance, into the different bodies, on multilateral international agreements, on climate, on biodiversity coming up soon, on human rights, on protecting human rights defenders, on mining issues, on extractive issues, on land use. So we take up these international issues, which are social justice issues. We take them from our roots as Catholics on Catholic social teaching, and we use that as our impetus to go and claim more dignity. So how are we involved in the Synod? I mean, the Synod is a perfect example of implementing, of bringing Laudato Si into a very concrete space. It's a territory, it's a physical territory where all of these issues are living at once. The human element, the ecological element, the spiritual element, all is there in one place. It's an extraordinary experience for us all to see one territory that encompasses all of these questions. And then that gives us a mirror back into our own territories. What's our link to that territory? What's our responsibility politically, economically to that territory? How are we the cause, as Bishop Bolen said, of some of the suffering that's far away in our minds, but is right at the end of our fingertips, or in a shopping center, or online as we order something, which was made where and was produced how, and where is our money invested, etc., etc. So our lives are very closely connected to those of the Amazon. Not only the Amazon, but in this case, we're talking about this territory to begin with. And I think that what's extraordinary is it's going to bring up questions that are very uncomfortable. It's going to bring to the surface questions of our colonial past and present, to be truthful, and how we are continuing certain patterns which are exploitative. And how do we overcome that? And that will take personal conversion. It will take massive political conversion, social conversion, and recognizing the planetary boundaries, recognizing that we need to move into a thinking that's completely foreign to us, perhaps, but of sufficiency, of sharing, of community, of common good, all things that we have access to through Catholic social teaching. So we have to go back to learning our roots and using this knowledge in everyday life and living it out. So it's a huge challenge for us personally, but collectively as well. But it's a fascinating and it's a compelling challenge, because every step, and as you can hear I'm getting excited, but every step you take deeper into this reflection, the more it inhabits you, and the more you believe in it, and the stronger you feel about it, and the more you want to talk about it to more people. So it has a positive spreading and contagious effect. And that's the Holy Spirit, of course, but it's present. And I believe it's already very much at work in the preparation of this synod. So how have we been preparing? Well, we've been working closely with REPAM. We've been trying to share the narrative, a different story about the Amazon, a different story about the people of the Amazon, a different story about our relationship to nature, relationship to goods, and transforming that into political messaging, which we are taking into the European institutions right now. Concretely, what does that look like? It looks like bringing that discussion into conversations with politicians about Mercosur, bringing it into discussions about trade relations between Europe and Latin America, bringing it into discussions about the Paris Agreement, about climate justice, bringing it everywhere we can. We bring the same messages and we bring them in. who do we go with? We go with Voices from the Amazon. Repam sends us some friends. We say, yes, we'll take them in with us. And we stand there side by side and we confuse the politicians, but that's important. It has to be a challenge. It has to be a personal challenge to these people, recognizing their power and recognizing that we have to change that dynamic. So CIDSE's role, I mean, we're doing what we can. We're relatively small in a sense, but we're not alone. We're joining our voices with many, many others, including REPAM, but also the bishops' conferences here in Europe. We're working with COMECE, which is the Conference of European Bishops' Conferences, and they do incredible advocacy work. Another thing we do, and I mentioned this earlier in the French webinar, so I don't want to forget to say it now. The church is a huge actor in advocacy, huge. Very important, the first defender of human rights, usually on the ground. We stand by them as well. It's not about us substituting the work of advocacy that's being done already in the Amazon. It's about holding up those voices and giving them more volume, more space, getting them into spaces that they don't have access to. So that's all we're trying to do. We're just trying to open doors where we can and use that advantage that we might have geographically sometimes to make sure that those voices are getting the space they deserve and the messages that they can get their messages across. I guess I'll stop there because I think there's just so many ways that we could take this conversation, but I think the essence of what I want to say is there is a role for Catholics to pick up Catholic social teaching and turn it into action, and that's always been the case. We haven't invented anything, but this is what we do. This is our contribution, and through organizations like Development and Peace in Canada, those actions are accessible to any individual and any collective, and we encourage you to take up that moment. There has to be reflection and then action.
Thank you, Josianne. I think you gave us a very concrete feeling of how we can take action and how advocacy plays such an important role in what will come out of the synod and how we can respond to its outcomes and to the voices that are speaking from the Amazon and how that applies to our different territories. We have several questions that have started to come in. I think the first one I'll ask, I think Bishop Bolen might be best placed to answer. The question is, how can we work to counter the culture of consumerism that exists in our society and this societal attitude of entitlement that sometimes I think we experience here in Canada and in North America?
Right, thank you. Well, it's an invitation to be attentive to the gospel. The gospel moves us towards others. It moves us towards our Creator. It moves us into a relationship with God and with others, which has very little to do with the culture of consumerism. I think when we're looking for societal change, we always do well to look to the poor and those who are in need, and to, as Maurizio spoke of Pope Francis, to adopt a posture of listening and to hear the voices of suffering in our midst. Now, some of those voices that we need to attend to are local voices, and I highlighted the need to listen to Indigenous people of Canada, and that in itself then moves us to action away from preoccupation with consumerism, to a different kind of society, a culture of encounter. But it also invites us at this particular time and when the synod is going on, to listen to the voices of our poor brothers and sisters in the Amazon region, to listen to the struggles there, listen to the way in which Indigenous people in the Amazonian region are being marginalized and oppressed, and to look for ways to stand in solidarity. I think listening to the voice of suffering is always the way to put us back on track to our God, who came to live among us and sided with those who were suffering and gave himself fully. Right? So I think that's a starting point anyway.
Thank you. We have another question here. As you know, Pope Francis has spoken out a lot about fake news. It's something he's addressed in some of his speeches, particularly on World Communication Day. And here we have a question. I think, Maurizio, this one might be best for you. It says, how do we respond to people who say that the fires in the Amazon are fake and that it's just natural? So what can people respond to that when they get that type of response from people when talking about the fires that are happening in the Amazon right now?
Well, I think it's important to recognize that these fires are also a representation of many other fires. Our home has been on fire for many years, and it's important because then we would not be distracted by the opposing news coming in and trying to get us to pick one side or the other. It's evident that we are reaching a tipping point in terms of deforestation, in terms of climate change, in terms of hunger. I think it's having 800 million people today experiencing hunger at the same time that we are discarding and throwing away 40% of the food that we produce. That tells us that this house on fire is not only about the actual fires in the Amazon, but it's a structural reality. I think it's important to pay attention to that because this calls for an integral conversion. And yes, I think the fires, we can see satellite data. And one of the most specialized entities as to follow up on these things is actually in Brazil. And they presented the data. And yes, it's normal. This part of the year, it's dry. It's also the winds are somehow feed on those fires. But we are increasing by 800% the number of fires that are happening right now. And why? There is also a reason. In both cases, Brazil and Bolivia, so you can see this is not ideological. This is not left side or right side. You have Evo Morales from the very left side, and then you have Bolsonaro from the very right side. Both presented decrees in which they were encouraging and making it more accessible and undermining laws for people to expand the agribusiness frontier. And this is what happens when you do that. And again, I say, this is not ideological because you have both extremes doing exactly the same thing. In Brazil, it was a little worse because those people supporting agribusiness called for the day of fire or the fire day. So we saw the information on how they were organizing themselves to set fire all over the place. And so they did. And they felt that they were encouraged by how the president, who should be also in charge of helping to keep peace and unity, somehow encouraging people to do that. So we need to also pay attention to those decisions coming from either way, left or right, trying to open up for this extractive industry and many times encouraged by interests of corporations elsewhere. So it's not about blaming other people. It's not about pointing fingers at anybody. It's just that we are reaching a point of no return, and we know it. 99% of the scientists of the planet recognize that climate change is there, that we are in a climate crisis, and that we produce it with the way we've decided to live. So in this moment, it's not about just changing everything and becoming something that we are not, but we are called for a more simple lifestyle, to recognize how my decisions in daily life impact the others. But at the same time, what happens in the Amazon eventually will have an impact in my life. Remember, 1 out of 5 glasses of water every human being drinks every day, and probably 1 out of 5 breaths anyone takes in this planet is also produced there. So it's really about having this possibility of communing. Let me just share a little anecdote. When we were with Pope Francis preparing for the synod, we were drinking coffee with a priest, a very good friend of ours, and the Pope approached. So we had a very nice conversation, but he became very serious and he said, do not forget what's most important. Pay attention to what's most important. The peripheries become the center. And this is very important. Just as we see that we have failed And this is, again, not to blame specific persons, but it's important to know what are the structural causes. We are invited to recognize what are the enlightening elements that come from the Amazon region. And it's not about changing our religious tradition. It's more finding a more harmonic way of connecting with our environment, with one another, and with life. And I think this is also very important. As, again, I was mentioning Teilhard de Chardin, we are, in a way, spiritual beings having a human experience. We are here for a reason, and we are invited to conduct this flow of life so we can have plentiful lives, help others have plentiful lives, and think about the future. The transgenerational justice that Laudato Si also presents as a new element and my final word would be, this is, as Pope Francis says, a universal ethical imperative. We're all together on this, or we have to take responsibility for what we fail to do together.
Thank you, Mauricio. We're getting a lot of questions, so we'll try to address as many as we can. So Josianne, maybe the next question you might want to answer, working at CIDSE and seeing what many of the CIDSE organizations do. One of the questions is, how do we get social justice work more in religious education at the parish level? And there's several questions that have come in about how can parishioners and at the parish level, how can that listening that we're speaking of begin to take place? And maybe Bishop Bolen, you might want to add on that after Josianne speaks as well.
Yeah, it's less to do with what I do now as what I used to do at Development and Peace, trying to help the campaigns to take life in the parishes. But I see it in my own parish here. So I think that people need to stop underestimating how much they can influence what gets discussed in their parish. I think they just need to step up, bring the subject. I've rarely seen I mean, it happens, of course, but I've rarely seen where a priest, a parish priest, refuse a discussion if a number of parishioners ask for it, because it's their community, and they have the responsibility to keep that community alive. So if they feel that a subject is important, of course, it means taking responsibility. It means getting involved in the Catholic education of our children. It means getting involved in the pastoral activities. It means stepping up. It's a lot of work. And so it's hard to just pass. It's easier to just say, well, somebody should be doing it. It's harder to say, okay, I guess that would be me. Because that's the only solution I've found, to be honest, is if I want my children to know about Laudato Si, I have to tell them about it. If I want that in the preparation of their sacraments, it gets involved that we're talking about common good, I have to go to the meetings on a Wednesday night and say, okay, I'll volunteer and come speak once during the preparation, and I'll explain what I know, and I'll share what I know and my understanding. And it's always been appreciated. I think that for the whole, we have to stop being so mistrusting, I think, of our own communities, and rather go and get maybe sometimes the silent side people who are too shy, maybe who don't feel they have the capacity. But we all have leadership in us. And I think when we have faith and we care for our community and we care for our children and we care for this planet, we have to bring that sincerity and that love into our communities. And that is much more powerful than the mistrust and the fear of being criticized, or the fear of conflict around these things. These are important truths about the climate justice, about our common home, about life on this earth. And I think that we have to take individual and collective responsibilities, whether it's at the political level or in the communities that we live in. These messages have to get across.
Thank you, Josianne. So Bishop Bolen, maybe I'll let you also respond to that. And also, we've received a few questions on what will be the role of the Canadian Church in the Synod, and will the Church in Canada be responding in any way?
Right. Okay, thanks. I guess two things on the first set of questions. I mean, I think the Development and Peace Fall Action materials are are a very good way for parishes to engage in this issue. So I hope that they get widely distributed and used. Secondly, I think there's a wonderful educational opportunity right now. And I think that the Synod puts it before us. I would think large parishes that have resources to organize some kind of an educational event in their parish. And I mean, ideally, I think to have a couple of speakers and one who could speak informatively about the experience, what's happening in the Amazon right now, both environmentally and to the indigenous peoples there, and their rights and their struggle. And to have somebody local, and if it would be possible, to have an Indigenous elder, for instance, to come and talk about the experience of Indigenous people in that particular city or region, because those are voices we don't tend to hear very well in our churches. So I think that would be a practical thing that could be done. In terms of the Canadian Church and its involvement in the Synod, well, I believe it was yesterday, a statement come out from the Canadian Bishops' Conference on the Synod, talking about the importance of it, and talking about how we'll be following it closely. Secondly, I think that the follow-up to the Synod is as important to the Synod itself or other parts of the world. It was said earlier that the Synod is, in some sense, Laudato Si, being focused on one particular region. And I think we have to do that work each in our own regions. But I hope we will be following prayerfully and attentively the Synod. There is an event that is going to be taking place in Rome for 1 week of the Synod. And I think it's organized principally by Jesuits, but in consultation with REPAM. And I'm going for that 1 week, looking forward to being there. I don't know, Josianne, are you going for that week as well? But in any case, people from different parts of North America are certainly attending, and we're going to have opportunity to meet with Synod participants and hopefully try to bring some of the questions and the reflections back to this country.
Thank you, Bishop Bolen. So I'll take, we'll end with 2 questions that I think maybe Mauricio, you could address. And one is, ecumenically, what can be done as a response, or, with regards to the Synod and what's happening in the Amazon? Obviously, the Synod is a Catholic moment, but is there space ecumenically for other groups to join in some way? And the other question is also, there are some farmers in the Amazon who support industrialization. And so how do we sort of understand those people and include them in the situation that is happening there?
Thank you, Kelly. If you allow me, I'd like to touch on some of the other elements in different questions in how we can respond to this reality and why is it relevant to have the Canadian public, the Canadian church, the Canadian Catholics to work together and also have a worldwide perspective. I think we can focus on the virtuous or the life-giving circuits, and people sitting right now, right here at this webinar, represent that possibility of a life-giving circuit. I remember very much how REPAM, working with the people on the ground, with indigenous leaders, with farmers on the ground, and whose rights have been violated, we started a formation program on human rights, not to speak on their behalf, but to give them the tools so they can defend themselves. And we could do that because of the support of the people in Canada. It was, at first, it was a financial support. We could only organize that formation training program for 5 weeks with people from all over the Amazon, thanks to the support of the people, of the Catholics and others in Canada, recognizing that there is a need to experience solidarity. Then we did a long process of formation, documentation of the cases, and here we were at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights, 2015, on March, and we had a bishop coming from Canada just to express solidarity, knowing that a number of the violations of human rights were related to corporations in Canada. And this was Bishop Bolen right here. He was sitting there, and at the beginning, we had agreed not to have them speak if they didn't want to expose themselves, because it was such a political ground. And I remember very well Bishop Bolen taking a stand and talking at the end of the session and saying, we have to take responsibility for this in a positive way. We want to be here in solidarity, but we want to bring also our own reflection. And then same thing with the leaders on the ground, as Josianne was saying, we had a chance to go to the European Union, thanks to CIDSE, and to provide the possibility for the indigenous leaders. And they wouldn't have had this chance unless we had this big major circuit as Catholic Church, and they had a chance to speak to the people in responsibility. And I think that they changed their minds while listening to what was happening on the ground. So this campaign that's coming now with Development and Peace is about the voices of the people of the Mura indigenous communities, among others, in the Amazon region. So I think it's very important to recognize how much we can do and how connected we are. The whole discussion on the ombudsperson for Canada, which is connected to a local reality, is in fact a global response on taking up solidarity together. So I think this is really, really impressive on how much we can do, as Josianne was mentioning, if we understand the importance of walking together, which is actually the meaning of synodality, walking together for this common purpose. And on the other question, the interreligious dialogue, I'd say not only ecumenical, but interreligious dialogue. In a place such as the Amazon, the indigenous communities also express their own spiritualities. Are we capable of dialoguing with them? There is no threat on dialoguing with that reality. And for those who are Catholics, they are entitled to also find a way to embrace and reaffirm their own cultures at the same time as they experience their being Catholics fully. This is what's been happening for decades in the Amazon region. It's just that sometimes we don't understand or recognize the importance of building bridges. So there is a lot of ecumenical dialogue and interreligious dialogue taking place in this process and this synodal process. I think, in fact, this is why we get a lot of opposition from some sides saying that we should not, as Catholic Church, worry about those other realities unless we were there to impose our own way of seeing things. And this is about sharing. This is a possibility to protect life and the future together. And those who are Catholics, we are also trying to embrace the need for a more relevant presence. We don't have enough people or resources to be there anymore. So we need to find changes that can enable the possibility for them to continue being believers. So I think this is very important. And those farmers supporting also the expansion of agribusiness, I have to say that the small scale farmers are also part of our process. We don't work only with indigenous peoples. The church is there for everyone. But the problem with the ecological crisis and with inequality is not about those very, very small scale farmers. They are entitled to have their own development. They should not become something that they are not. It is the big corporations with no limits, representing, as I said, this huge inequality in the world, which bring this complexity and a challenge. So the final thing somebody was saying in their questions, why do we focus so much in justice and not life? I think we need to understand that this is an integral approach. If you read Laudato Si, and the strongest and most important category in Laudato Si is integral ecology. It's about human ecology, life, protecting life every time. But it's also about political ecology, social ecology, economic ecology, cultural ecology, transgenerational justice. The problem is that we only have one focus. Many of us, all of us are to blame for that. we need to embrace and achieve a multi-level and multi-dimensional view. Otherwise, we'll just be protecting our small space, saying that that's the only one that's important. If we want to bring the kingdom and offer the kingdom, the possibility of the kingdom for the future, we need to find a way to integrate all of it in this perspective. And this is, I think, our core call as Catholics.
Thank you, Maurizio. I think that was a very good way to end the question period. Many of you mentioned Development and Peace's new campaign. So I just want to share with everyone online right now our website, which shows our new campaign. As you can see, hang on, I'll just go back. We have a lot of resources online. You know, we always wonder, how can we take action when we hear of these injustices? Often we feel somewhat powerless. And with this campaign, we like to give people concrete ways that they can really build their solidarity with people and with people that are not close to us. And it's that culture of encounter that Pope Francis speaks of. So this year, we are asking people to sign a solidarity letter, which is addressed to 2 communities in the Amazon in Brazil. The situation in Brazil is quite concerning right now. There's rapid deforestation. The rights of indigenous peoples are being stripped away. So one community is, as Maurizio mentioned, the Mura people, who are being threatened by a mine, a potash mine that's financed with by a Canadian company. And also the Seringueiros are a community of artisanal rubber tappers who live a very sustainable way of life in the Amazon, but are being threatened and displaced by deforestation. So we want to send them a letter of solidarity saying that we are listening to them, we are by their side. And also with these signatures, we want to try to do some advocacy at the national and international level and approach the companies, the Canadian government and the Brazilian government to say that you know, many Canadians are very concerned about what is happening in the Amazon. So we've just launched today, so we only have 4 signatures. Our goal is 65,000, so we have a bit of a ways to go, but I encourage you to visit our website. And you can also take a intergenerational pledge. We're very inspired by the student mobilizations that have been happening and how young people want politicians, leaders, and older generations to take responsibility for the damage that's been done and to take real drastic action and do what's needed to save the planet. So here we're encouraging you to take this pledge where you can make a personal change in your life. And, you know, sometimes we think these changes don't make a big difference, but, you know, we're the ones who influence companies and influence how consumer trends take place. So when we consume less, it does have an impact. So take that pledge, and you can send us a photo. Here we have Bishop Bolen with a lovely heart that says, "I care for our common home," and we're going to build a nice mosaic. So we'll send you a message with lots of this information. And once you receive it, you can sign. And also this webinar is being recorded, so we'll send you the recording if you'd like to share it. And I want to thank everyone. I don't know if Bishop Bolen or Josianne or Maurizio would like to say any final words today, or I think a lot was discussed, but I think Maurizio would like to say one last thing.
I just want to say that in your campaign, what might be photos for some people, these are friends. I see Jeremias from the Mura people. We've been working with them for a while, and Jessica Patiachi. I think that that's what we are meant to do. Thank you for building bridges. This is lives and their future and our own future. So just want to thank you for this beautiful opportunity, Kelly. And I was very happy with the privilege of sharing with Bishop Bolen and Josianne, and I'll see you 3 in Rome.
So I want to thank everyone who participated today. I think Bishop Bolen, Josianne, and Maurizio gave us much information to reflect on, to really feed our spirits as we approach this synod and as we launch this campaign. So thank you to everybody and have a wonderful afternoon.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thanks very much. God bless.